Hi, everybody. We're going to go ahead and jump right into the 1920s. The 1920s are also known as the Roaring Twenties or the Jazz Age. Some people call it the Age of Wonderful Nonsense, although I don't hear that very often. It's really more the Roaring Twenties or the Jazz Age. Some interesting statistics from that time period. I'm not going to read all these to you, but one might be that it takes 13 days, which is almost 2 weeks, to drive to California from New York on a two-lane road. When by today's standards, now you can take a plane and get there in 4 hours. As far as lifespan, men lived to be about 54 on the average in the 20s, and women lived to be about 55. That's pretty young, I think. But by today's standards, men live to be about 73 or later, and women live to be a little bit longer at 79 or later. So things do change over time. Prohibition was put into place in 1919 through the 18th Amendment, which is the Act of Prohibition, which is it makes it illegal to make, transport, or sell alcohol. The intent of this amendment was to lower the crime rate and to improve the general way of life, but really the opposite happened. Crime increased because people rebelled. They wanted to have their alcohol, and when they couldn't have it, they were going to find a way to have it anyway. People began making homemade alcohol using something called a still. When those people made the alcohol and then sold it, they became what is called or known as bootleggers. Numerous illegal bars started popping up all over the place during Prohibition because people still wanted to drink. And these bars would be called speakeasies because when people would drink, they would say that they would start to just talk about stuff maybe they shouldn't. It was easy to speak, so they called them speakeasies. And that was an illegal place, like a bar where you could go get alcohol. Gangsters definitely profited during Prohibition because they would smuggle alcohol and distribute it to different illegal businesses like speakeasies. This guy here is Al Capone. He was from Chicago. He was one of these gangsters. He made $105 million a year just smuggling alcohol, which is a lot of money when we look at today's standards and those days' standards. In the 1920s, the 19th Amendment was passed, which gave the women the right to vote. However, there was concern that they wouldn't exercise their right to vote, and in the beginning, they didn't. They didn't want to. They didn't want to vote. But things started to change in the 1920s. Women started to change. They started to become what we call flappers. And a flapper is a woman who's a little more brazen than what they were in the past. They would wear their hair short. They would wear these hats. This hat that this woman's wearing here is called a cloche. They would wear shorter skirts. They would dance. They would smoke cigarettes. They would drink alcohol. They would try to take some of the same jobs as men. They wanted equality in the workspace. This was very different than what had been going on before. They were considered reckless rebels because of the way they dressed. These dresses, they were like kind of straight. They weren't so curvy. They weren't form fitting like women used to wear prior to that, where they would wear like girdles and things like that to have a smaller waist and wider hips. These women would wear makeup in public. Their legs would show. And they enjoyed dancing, and especially the Charleston, which was a really popular dance in the jazz clubs. Men took their fashion ideas from the sports of the gangster look. Men wanted to appear dapper, and that was a term of the 20s, which was baggy pants, polished shoes, a handkerchief in the pocket. Let others know that this man was someone to pay attention to. These suits are called zoot suits. They were for fancy occasions. Henry Ford began the mass production of the Model T automobile. And so the first car price, so the average man could afford one, and that was the object, so that average people could have a car. Other well-known inventions would include Band-Aids, Kleenex, zippers. A lot of times people just use buttons before zippers. New food products introduced in the 20s, Welch's grape jelly, Wrigley's chewing gum, Eskimo pies, which was ice cream. As far as entertainment went, the radio was very important to families because they didn't have TVs at the time, so they gather around at certain times and listen to popular shows. Um, One popular show that would be Little Orphan Annie. People would sit around and listen to the story of Little Orphan Annie, and they would also listen to some of these other stories that we have listed here as well. Silent movies were known as talkies when sound was finally added. Chaplin, this guy right here in the picture, was known as the Little Tramp. It was one of his most famous stars in motion picture history. He wrote and directed nearly all of his films and composed the music for all of his sound pictures. Favorite actors were Rudolph Valentino, who's right here, Clara Bow, Mary Pickford, and Al Jolson, the star of The Jazz Singer. Now, Al Jolson, here's what's difficult. He was a white man who dressed in blackface. And nowadays, that is so inappropriate. But in those days, people found it to be entertainment. You also have to remember in the 1920s, racism was prolific. This guy is Alvin Kelly. He's also known as Shipwreck Kelly. He decided that he was going to try to sit on a flagpole in response to a dare from a friend. He sat there for 13 hours and 13 minutes. And then within weeks, hundreds of people were trying to become the king of the pole. One man sat for 12 days, another for 17, and another for 21. In Atlantic City, New Jersey, Kelly reclaimed the title by sitting atop a flagpole for 49 days in front of the 20,000 people. Kind of crazy. It's like, the age of nonsense, all right. The Charleston was a dance. Um, it's thought to have originated with the African Americans who were living on a small island near Charleston, South Carolina. But in 1922 and 23, it was introduced to the theater, going public at the New York Amsterdam Theater in New York. Women who did the Charleston were called flappers because of the way they would flap their arms and walk like birds while doing the Charleston. Many of the men of the period wore raccoon coats and straw hats. Favorite children's books of the time: Winnie the Pooh, Bambi, Dr. Dolittle, and the Velveteen Rabbit. Now, we see these cartoons, but these were not cartoons at the time. Bambi was a story, and so was Winnie the Pooh. Favorite toys included the new baby doll that said Mama, paper dolls, teddy bears. Boys played with metal trucks, Tinker Toys, and erector sets. Kids, like on the playground, would play marbles, jump rope, roller skating, statues. Mickey Mouse, Little Orphan Annie, and Felix the Cat were popular cartoon characters. Now, here's some slang words. All wet would be describing someone who has a wrong idea or a person, like he's all wet. Applesauce. What you would say when you were angry. Instead of cussing, you'd say, oh, applesauce. The big cheese would be someone who's the most important person or the boss. He's the big cheese. If you're the cat's meow, you're something awesome or you're the best. Cheaters wear eyeglasses. And if everything's Jake, everything's okay. So that's how some people talked in those days. Dogs would mean your feet, my dogs are tired, or my dogs are barking would be your feet hurt. Giggle water is alcohol. Heebie jeebies, a scary, nervous feeling. Jalopy would be an old car. And a moll would be a gangster's girlfriend. So a pushover, someone easily convinced, they're gullible. You'd say so and so is a pushover. Or scram would be like beat it, leave, get out of here. Swell is wonderful. That's swell. Upchuck. My grandmother used to say upchuck when she would talk about throwing up. It used to drive me crazy. So if you were going to upchuck, you were going to throw up. And whoopee would be having a good time. So some important people of the era were Amelia Earhart. She's the first female aviator to cross the Atlantic Ocean and the first woman to fly solo. She disappeared in 1937 in an attempt to be the first woman to fly around the world. It says no trace of Miss Earhart or her plane have ever been found, but I think that if you watch the History Channel, there have been some traces of her found on an island in the South Pacific. Babe Ruth was the greatest slugger in baseball history. His record of 714 regular season home runs wasn't broken until 1974 by Hank Aaron. He was named to the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1936. I'm going to pass by this one. Red Grange. He was a football player. Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald was the one of the great writers of the Jazz Age. F. Scott Fitzgerald began his career as a writer of stories for mass circulation magazines. He was one of the main writers for the Saturday Evening Post. The publication of his novel, This Side of Paradise, made him famous overnight. Bessie Smith was a blues singer. During her heyday, she earned upwards of $2,000 per week, which was huge. She was one of the most respected black singers in America and had recorded a lot of blues songs that still stand today. King Oliver is a legend in jazz history as a trumpet player. Louis Armstrong is who you hear of most these days when you think about the 20s. He played solos, but he was a trumpet player, making jazz history, and it was in Chicago that he initiated his scat singing, which is singing nonsense syllables in place of words and vocally simulating instrumental sound. We'll listen to some of that in class. Herbert Hoover was the President of the United States from 1928 to 1932. He was a millionaire businessman and a successful public official. But after he took office, shortly thereafter, the stock market did crash and the Great Depression began. And this is my resource page if you want to look up anything that you might need. That's the end of this lecture today, and I will see you in class.